Now it is my great honor to welcome you to today's conversation with Dr. Emiliana Vegas, co-director and senior fellow at the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. My name is Christine Minwatipka, director of the Master's Program in International Comparative Education and International Education Policy Analysis, a faculty member and alum of the Stanford Graduate School of Education. I have the pleasure of introducing our host, Dr. Christopher Thomas, who will introduce Dr. Vegas. Dr. Christopher Thomas is the Stanford Graduate School of Education's Social Entrepreneur in Residence and Lecturer in 2020. For the past 25 years, Chris has worked with the World Bank in many of the world's poorest countries to address the biggest challenges in education. We thank Chris for introducing us to Emiliana and for making today's event possible. We also want to thank External Relations in the GSE, particularly Manaf Mansour, for partnering with us on this amazing event. Without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Chris Thomas and Dr. Emiliana Vegas.
Thank you, Christine. So it is a real honor to welcome Dr. Emiliana Vegas to the Stanford community. She's a long-time colleague and friend. Emiliana is a senior fellow and co-director of the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution, which she joined in 2019. She was chief of the education division at the Inter-American Development Bank from 2012 to 2019, and lead economist of the World Bank prior to that. Emiliana has written extensively on teacher effectiveness, school finance, and early childhood development, and she's put her ideas into practice. At the Inter-American Development Bank, she led a team of 50 professionals who worked with governments throughout Latin America and the Caribbean on programs to improve learning and skills. She ensured financing for SUMA, the first regional laboratory for education research and innovation in Latin America. She created training programs for education leaders and influencers and helped ministries of education leverage technology to improve information flows and decision-making. Policy's never been an abstract issue for Emiliana. She's driven by an overwhelming commitment to high-quality education for all and to helping children and young people everywhere reach their full potential. Emiliana, we're so happy you can join us today, and thank you for sharing your time and your thoughts with us. We're going to speak mainly about COVID-19, school closures, and inequality, but maybe you can start off a bit by telling us about the Center for Universal Education and what you're trying to achieve.
Thank you so much, Chris, for inviting me, and Christine for organizing with your colleagues this talk. I'm very excited and honored to be able to reach out to you and to meet you and see some familiar faces and some old friends in the audience. It's really a pleasure. Yes, I see Romy, thank you. I actually incorporated into the presentation some slides about Brookings and the Center for Universal Education. So I'm going to share my screen and then I'll just move right along. Hopefully I'll do the right thing here and share the presentation. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Great. So as I said, I'll start with a little bit about Brookings. As you may know, Brookings Institution is a think tank based in Washington, D.C. We basically have three key values, which are independence, quality, and impact. And so we're a nonpartisan think tank. We conduct high quality research, but we really care about the impact. And we were founded really with a mission of helping originally inform US policymakers. But as the institution is now over 100 years old, we've also expanded to having more of a global outlook. Brookings has 5 research areas, or research programs as we call them. Governance studies, economic studies, metropolitan policy, foreign policy, and global economy and development. And the Center for Universal Education is part of the Global Economy and Development Research Program. Our mission at CUE, as we call it, is to accelerate education change to equip all children, youth, and adults to thrive in a rapidly changing world. And to do that, we have 4 key research areas. The first one is one that we're really keen on promoting. It's called Promoting Innovation to Accelerate Learning. With my co-director, Rebecca Winthrop, we've written a lot on leapfrogging inequality and helping systems really accelerate change, follow different paths than today's best performing education systems, because we're very concerned that the learning gap between high performing and low performing education systems is continuing to grow instead of narrow. Second area that we do a lot of research on has to do with scaling to achieve system transformation. And what we have been doing with my colleague Jenny Perlman Robinson and other colleagues is really working closely with several institutions in countries around the world that are trying to really bring about reforms, and from the beginning really work with them to learn about the process of implementing large-scale reforms and learning as you go and then making modifications. So just as we would explain it, you know, in our work with Chris in the banks, we would design a project, implement, and then at the end have an evaluation to see if we met our goals, if the project reached its objectives. And sometimes it did, and sometimes it didn't, and sometimes it fell in between. What this project really is trying to do is not wait until that endpoint, and along the way really partner with research institutions and implementers to be monitoring what is the impact we're having and how we need to change the implementation to be able to achieve the objectives, you know, along the way. The third big research area is what we call preparing individuals for a rapidly changing world. And here we really talk about a breadth of skills that individuals need today and will need in the future to succeed and to contribute to their societies. And in a world that's changing so rapidly, as we all clearly know now more than ever, what does that mean to have a breadth of skills? And we have a series of different research areas, including on computer science education, education technology, socio-emotional skills, etc. And the fourth area is really ensuring no one is left behind. And this really involves work related to girls' education, refugees and migrants, and other disadvantaged groups. And just to conclude on this part on Brookings in the center, I think Brookings is interesting because it is an EDU, not an org. So we are an education institution. We're also a think tank. But what we do in terms of our research is not just conduct research in an ivory tower kind of way, but rather conduct research where oriented toward building capacity. So we advise, we review plans, but also engaging the actors that we want to influence along the way. So as you will notice, we don't always publish the final product and at the very end. We will publish pieces along the way. We will have convenings. We will seek feedback to enhance the work and to especially make it more relevant to our intended audiences, who are mostly decision makers, whether they're policy makers or heads of big donor organizations, foundations, multilateral institutions, etc. So I guess we'll get questions later, but I'll move on to the topic of the presentation, which has to do with a recent report I published on school closures and government responses around the world. In this graph, I show basically before I tell you the graphs, let me just tell you what we tried to do, and then the graphs will become more easily understandable. We merged data from the Center for Global Development, which collected data on how governments are responding to the need to close schools around the world in each country, and then what kinds of combinations of online education, TV, radio, or really just distributing materials if they were able to, they are using. And what we did is we used data then from the World Bank on income level by country, on regions of the world, and also data from the OECD PISA to try and look more closely at the PISA systems or the countries that participate in PISA. Why did we focus On income levels and regions, it's pretty obvious. There's lots of difference around the world, and we wanted to kind of get a sense of what this would mean for inequality. And then we looked at the countries that choose to participate in PISA as a proxy for countries that are really striving to improve. So our assumption is that when a government decides to participate in an international assessment such as PISA, they're opening themselves to evaluating themselves and benchmarking themselves against other countries, many of which are going to be higher performing. And so it's a signal that they're interested in improving. And so we wanted to look at what they're doing in this period of crisis as well. So now let me turn to this first graph, where we have in each bar grouped countries by income level, from low income to lower middle income, upper middle, and high income countries. And what the colors represent are the type of, let's say, distance learning services that they're providing during the school closures. So blue is online and broadcast, yellow is TV and radio, gray and orange are radio and TV only respectively, and green is online only. And the line shows the average share of the population that is connected to the internet in these groups of countries. The first thing to note is that in low-income countries, we have a much lower connectivity rate than in high-income countries. So the digital divide across income levels is real. And that, of course, also means that they're less likely to use online resources, which we see in the graph. Indeed, less than 25% of low-income countries are currently providing any type of remote learning. The majority of them are using TV and radio. And this is in contrast to high-income countries where 90% are providing remote learning opportunities, and nearly all of them online. In this graph, we do a similar breakdown, but instead of by income level, we do it by region of the world. So what we have is from left to right, East Asia and the Pacific, Europe and Central Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, Middle East and North Africa, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And the same categories here. It's interesting to note that in most regions, there is a high share of countries doing some sort of remote learning opportunities, with the exception of Sub-Saharan Africa, where it's less than 30% of the countries that are offering some sort of remote learning. And of these, as you can see, only 11% rely exclusively on online opportunities. The rest of the countries, they use a mix again, and it's really leads kind of to the conclusion that if you're a student today in Sub-Saharan Africa, you're at great disadvantage with respect to other regions of the world. So among the countries using online education resources, we also looked at what types of resources are they using. This is a very rough approximation to try and get a sense of what may be the level of engagement of students, but it's really, as we'll talk in the end of the talk, and I know I got some questions around what would be useful research, really getting much more in-depth information around what's actually happening during this period with students and teachers at the individual level would be very, very useful. But what we see here is that among the countries that are using online education resources, close to 60% are using online platforms, such as Canvas, Blackboard, etc. And close to 35% are distributing educational videos online. Also around 30% are just posting suggested resources that students can access, and then less you can see in terms of using actual modules for educating students, for providing teacher support, or video games. So in this graph, what we try to do is use the information that we had access to in terms of what countries are doing to support teachers during this period. We know from the evidence internationally and in the US that teachers are the most important factor from the school side in student learning. So how teachers are able to be supported and guided during this difficult period is a signal of what type of outcomes we might expect later on. And what we see again is that most countries, most regions of the world are doing a combination of providing guidance to teachers during this period of remote training, and then also providing support directly with professional development opportunities to those teachers. So that's the green and the yellow. The exception, again, is Sub-Saharan Africa, where the only thing they could do was provide some guidance, but they haven't been able so far to provide any training at the time of writing this note. So here's the closer look at those countries that participated in PISA 2018. And what we do in this chart is we separate the countries by their level of performance in PISA. So the first quartile are the 25th lowest performing countries, and the fourth quartile are the 25th highest performing countries, let's put it that way. And one thing that you can see is that nearly 85% of countries that participated in PISA in 2018, they offer educational opportunities during the crisis. Many of them use a combination of online and broadcast, and this is true of all of them. But what can see is among the highest performing countries, which also tend to be the ones with the highest GDP per capita, as the blue line shows, the proportion of online only, let's say systems that went online exclusively, is much greater. Which suggests, it doesn't necessarily indicate, but it does suggest that a bigger effort for having, let's say, a more engaging type of process than, as we know, TV and radio can provide. So let me conclude with some implications for inequality and then open it up to a conversation with you, because I'm eager to hear your questions and comments as well. The first conclusion, I guess, from the data is that we see that COVID-19 will have huge impacts on student learning across the world, but students in low-income countries, and especially those in Sub-Saharan Africa, will be the hardest hit. With other colleagues, I've done some estimates of, for example, other costs of the crisis on students today in terms of estimating foregone earnings, given what we know of rates of return to education for additional years of schooling around the world, and also knowing that there's been at least 4 months, let's say, of learning loss in many countries. And those numbers are huge. We are finalizing a report that I hope we can publish next week that looks at it worldwide, but the initial calculations we did just for the US, the figures are staggering in terms of both the foregone earnings for individuals, but also the loss of GDP for the US economy. The second implication that we can, I guess, draw from the evidence is that in middle and high income countries that have broad internet access, the learning loss will depend much more on the quality of teaching and learning taking place remotely. And that's very hard to evaluate at this point, given the information we have. So one of the initiatives that we're taking with other colleagues and organizations is to try and see if we can collectively make an effort to collect real-time usage data and the way that students are interacting with teachers in this online or even remote world, even when it might be through phones, and some countries text messages, to see, maybe we'll find some really good insights into what may work when we go back to a new normal with technology, and with the need to sometimes go back perhaps to, again, working from or studying from home. The third insight is that the learning gap between rich and poor will likely grow during the pandemic, and what I've shown here are those differences among countries and among regions of the world. But we're also seeing firsthand how within countries there's a lot of inequality. Those of us who live in the US can see it right in our backyards. And we know that these learning gaps also will grow across different regions and communities within countries. And finally, although I couldn't get specific data on girls and migrant or refugee populations, we can assume from previous research and research throughout other pandemics like the Ebola pandemic in Africa that girls are at great risk, not only of losing learning opportunities, but also of dropping out of school, of having higher rates of adolescence pregnancy, And also migrant and refugee populations will likely suffer. So that's all I have to share. And I'm happy to engage with you in questions and answers.
Yes, thank you, Emiliana. It strikes me that the crisis is so all-absorbing now. But I think back to West Africa, where I started working. And it seems like, unfortunately, crisis management has become a regular function of government. Parts of West Africa have gone through wars in the last decades. They've gone through the financial crisis. They went through the Ebola epidemic. They've gone through repeated natural disasters. And schools have been opening and closing over time. And we're seeing the frequency of natural disasters, for example, increase in the world with climate change. What are we learning about the kinds of investments that governments could be making to maintain education, the continuity of education services, or plan for those increasingly frequent rainy days? Where would you put your emphasis on policy and investment?
So I think that's a really good question. And I guess I'm going to answer it in terms of where would I put it, after we can reopen schools. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Because I think I've been thinking a lot about, what are some of this is really, I understand that, there have been crises, financial crises and pandemics in some regions of the world, but I think this is historical in terms of the number of countries, the number of students affected, all at the same time in the world history. So, Unesco estimates that 1.5 billion students have been affected in over 190 countries of the world. It's quite remarkable. My hope is that this, that one is that we will return to a school where teachers, parents, and students will think of education quite differently, and policymakers will guide that, let's say. And what I mean by that is, schools were designed in the 19th century and pretty much stayed the same, although they've evolved somewhat in the 20th century when the massive expansions in access. And then in the 21st century, we've made some marginal changes. But the underlying model in most countries is the same, that kids enter at a certain age, they progress at the same pace in the same subjects, and they finish at the same age. And we know from the learning sciences so much more about the fact that students learn that individuals learn in different ways, in different rates, in different subjects even. So the way I might learn a foreign language is very different from how I might want to learn science or history. And I think this opportunity that parents have had to observe, in the best cases, their children learning from home, and that teachers have had to kind of be learning something else, how to provide an education in a very different setting. I hope that when we go back, we'll give an opportunity for schools to really reset and restart and rebuild differently, and really take stock of what we know about the learning science, about how to engage learners in a different way, and also that learners will take more ownership of their own educational trajectories. To me, the biggest investment that governments can make is in really shifting the whole way that we organize the school day and schooling to create a more autonomous learner, which is a skill we're going to need for the rest of our lives. And that I think in a lot of systems, you're seeing that the fact that schools had grades, had a certain structure, that was a big motivator to students. And in the absence of that, how can students still stay engaged?
Yeah. It also struck me, how COVID laid the inequities in society so bare. And people believe so much in education as an avenue of mobility or as an equalizer. But there's people that are so disadvantaged by their income, by where they live, by their gender, by their citizenship, etc. And these kinds of crises seem to reinforce those inequities in social structures rather than alleviate them. What can schools do to be more equitable? What can school systems do to become more powerful equalizers in times of crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really big, huge question, and undoubtedly this crisis in so many ways has, like you say, really put it, I think as my colleagues in Brookings who study the US were saying, that they're scholars of inequality, but it wasn't as clear to everybody else how unequal society in the US is. Worldwide, it's the same story. I think when, it's really hard to do it remotely. I think the distance education makes equally the sort of the role of schools or equalizers harder, because a lot of what schools do is provide an equal space, at least during the school hours, for all kids regardless of their home environment. Often they also provide nutrition, socio-emotional support, and it really, I think the emphasis as we go back is how to enhance those programs. One of the worries that a lot of us share who work in global education is that, if you look at what's happening worldwide with COVID, there was first the health concerns and the health crisis and all the investment going to develop the vaccines, the treatments, the tests, the types of things you need from the healthcare system, and provide support to healthcare workers or frontline workers. And that's obviously extremely necessary. Now, most governments are turning to, the economic crisis and providing fiscal stimulus to, private sector, to businesses, providing cash transfers to individuals and families who are losing their jobs. And all of that, again, is necessary. But in very few countries are they thinking of what's happening with the children who are currently out of school, and how are we going to support them financially to get back to school? How are we going to support school systems that are also being hit by the economic crisis? So I think a big concern that we have is how to protect and actually enhance education investment. Because in times of crisis, as you very well state, schools are going to be not only a huge motor in the future for economic development, but in the present too. They need to be able to provide, a safe place for children and youth to be while their parents can return to work. And they need to be a place where students and kids are gaining the skills. So that also requires support to teachers and support to schools and all the sorts of things we're talking about. In many cases, nutrition offers and socio-emotional support.
Yeah. Martin, I think you have a question. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask?
You're talking like you have evidence that any of these methods that are being used are better than in-classroom teaching. I mean, any of them. Do you have any evidence that anybody's doing anything that's better than classroom teaching?
Absolutely not. I'm sorry.
I'm saying with the resources that they have.
No. I absolutely don't think that anything that's happening anywhere, even in the best education systems, is better remote or let's say while schools are closed than if the schools were open. Okay. So if you remember, my first conclusion is everybody's going to be impacted. There's going to be learning loss everywhere.
Well, I wouldn't say learning loss. All you have to do is say, okay, this was like a long vacation, and we're just going to make everybody stay in school longer.
Yeah, I think that is a policy option for some countries, is how do you actually extend, maybe if once the healthcare crisis once it's safe, I guess, to go back to some sort of physical schooling, and it's varying by countries. We know that Denmark has already started reopening, elementary schools and preschools.
Well, if you really believe that there's so-called loss, then the way to make it up is like fill in a couple of summers. with school. You know, just make up the time. If you really believe it's the time
Yeah.
that is.
Well, I
main
think it's a
factor.
combination. I think there's the time. I also think there's differences in the experience that students have in different schools and different school systems in
Absolutely.
different countries.
Absolutely.
So in some cases,
and
that's
parents,
good.
the
Yeah, and
availability of
parents. Of
parents.
course. So I guess, I don't know that there's an answer to your, I mean, I agree with you that I think we can try and model it. This is sort of what we're trying to do, but it's very hard. And I think we will only know this, how big the impact, how big the learning loss was, how rapidly students were able to recover the lost time, let's say, if we collect very good data right now and in the next few months, years, to try and see not only what were the learning levels of students over this whole period, but also what were they doing and what were their schools doing.
Well, I mean, I'm just reacting to what you said about when everybody comes back, they're going to take all this online learning experience and they're going to see how to adapt it to the new situation, and schools will change and all this stuff. Now, that's fine if you have data that say, oh, this really worked better and we should do this instead of our regular classroom teaching. The other thing is that there's plenty, I wouldn't say plenty, but there's some pretty good evidence that what goes on in summers or vacation, what goes on in vacation time is actually quite important in terms of contributing to kids' learning, even if they're not in school. So it could be that if there's a lot of disequalization going on, and we know a lot of disequalization goes on in the summers, we should just fill in the summers with school. It'll cost a lot of money, but on the other hand, it might actually have it might re-equalize in some sense what happened during the period of not being in school. Anyway, I think we have blocks of time in which kids are not in school during normal times that can be used to catch up. And
I agree. And I think the most agreement we're in is that we need better data and much more information to.
But we know that you can fill in the time. I mean, there are months where people are out of school.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question too, because, for example, some countries were about to go in their summer breaks, given their school calendars, when they were hit by the pandemic. Right. So it'll be interesting, for example, to see if in those countries the learning loss, is much lower than countries that, were hit during the middle of the school year or, for a longer period. So there's a lot we don't know for sure.
Depends on the length of time that they're out.
Right.
Review at the Center on Education Technologies. Did you learn anything about the relative, or could you venture any guesses on the relative effectiveness of the different technologies that countries are employing, or is that something for future research as well?
I think it's a topic for research. What we did a catalog of kind of leapfrogging innovations, of which like 30% had to do with technology innovations. We are currently updating it, and also I'm doing a new piece oriented for ministers of education with some colleagues, but we are looking less at specific, country interventions and more at the types of, the ways in which technology can complement teaching and learning from what we know from the learning sciences. For example, things like, and so just to finish, I think what will be interesting to see, and that's why I think collecting data right now beyond what we have is so important, is, for example, if countries are using a lot of software that includes games, we know that, learning through play is something that, it tends to yield better results than, rote memorization. And so can we see that countries are investing more in that during this period, or certain systems? We don't know that yet, but it would be, it's certainly something we should look into.
And Daniel Denedy Frank has a question.
First of all, I just want to thank everyone for making this event available for alumni as well. I really appreciate it. I don't know if you could speak to this, given the international scope of what's happening in school closures with distance learning in different countries. But I'm really interested if you know of anyone who's researching how school closure is going to be felt differently by students of different ages.
Yeah, that's a super good question. I know that there's a lot of organizations that are interested in learning from this and doing research. There is, for example, the EdTech Hub, which is an organization funded by the World Bank and by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and by the Department of International Development from the UK. And I recently met with them, and they are doing a lot of, you can go into the webpage, but they're doing a lot of data collection. They're also working with other partners like us and other organizations, trying to better understand the differential impacts of this on students by age, by level of education, by gender. Center for Global Development certainly focusing on that. So I think there will be hopefully good evidence coming out of this, but it will take a while.
Amy Jo Dowd.
I'm really fascinated by the different ways that you see combinations in the data of the kinds of modalities used. So I'm wondering if there are any studies underway of sort of how these different things work in combination and whether or not some versions of the combinations work better for tackling inequities. Or any sort of learnings that we can look forward to having on sort of that front. So the different ways that a single system is using many technologies.
Hi, Amy Jo. So nice to see you. Yeah, I think it's, again, right now we just have the information of what countries are doing. I think we're going to have to wait and see what impact it had. But I do think that, the region of the world that I've worked mostly in is Latin America and the Caribbean, and there's so much inequality there, not only socioeconomically but also geographically. And one advantage I think many countries had is that they had a history of having TV and radio educational programs, and not necessarily a successful history, but there was a system, and there was it was in some cases the only way kids accessed secondary education in rural areas in Mexico was through telesecundaria, or radio education in indigenous parts of Peru, Paraguay or Peru. So they're going back to kind of, at least they had the systems in place, they had some materials, and they're using that. And I'm hopeful. I mean, and then other countries, including Peru and Chile, have complemented. And like you say, they're combining online resources with TV, very structured lessons by grade for all students. And so I remember when this started, seeing some news reports of kids even getting into their uniforms to watch TV from home. And the parents very proud of their, so there's a culture of that, which is touching. But do we know if it works? Not really.
Emiliana, Jane Chone asked a question online. It's similar to what you alluded to before, was that the schooling model hasn't really changed much in past years. Martin brought this up too. Do you think, and a lot of people are talking about reimagining the school, what do you think schooling might look like coming out of this crisis? Will things really change in terms of delivery and opportunities, especially for the poor?
I really hope so. I think that it would be a real tragedy if things didn't really change, especially for the poor after something like this, but it's a hope, let's put it that way. I think we have to work for that to happen. Those of us who work with policymakers, through our research, through any channel we can, to kind of put out the need for things to dramatically change. because as you said, as we know, they were already at a disadvantage and now they're even more so. You know, how that will look, you know, I've been looking closely, and I know Amy Jo's there, so she can talk to this maybe, but looking at the reports of what's happening in Denmark. But Denmark's, you know, a very wealthy country with lots of resources. So it's a good model for other OECD countries. For example, you know, reducing class sizes dramatically, limiting, you know, the groups of children that can hang out with each other and with adults, using a lot of outdoor space. It's all, you know, I was just reading an article in the Danish news media of a teacher saying it's her dream school now that she's back, because she has less students, there's less collective fights among teachers, and they're spending a lot of time doing project-based learning outdoors. Is that feasible in the poorest regions of Africa and Latin America and the Middle East and South Asia? You know, probably less likely, because the class sizes were already much bigger to begin with. Teachers are much less well equipped and supported than they are in more wealthy countries. But how can the international community, institutions like Unesco, the World Bank, the big foundations that are, you know, investing in this space really work together to alleviate and focus their efforts in these more needed countries? Because the countries that have more resources are clearly going to do better.
Yeah, it's a real shock. And you think that 65% of the world's children live in poor and lower middle income countries. And they're the ones that are at such a severe disadvantage here. That's the future, that's everyone's future is tied up in the fate of those children.
Yes, and you know, one of the things that I kind of ask myself and ask myself, given the, you know, what we know of these, you know, particularly crowded urban areas in poor countries, like in India, in Latin American big cities, in Brazil, and in my own home country of Venezuela, is that social distancing isn't very possible. People live in small quarters with big families. They work in the informal market and they live, you know, day by day in terms of their work. And so they're out there working. They're not social distancing in the way we are here in the United States. And yet their schools were also closed, which is probably the only source of nutrition for many of the children. So, you know, I wonder if one of the lessons we'll draw from this experience is that many countries kind of went to the closing schools, made that decision real quickly, but may not get the health benefits that other countries get from that. And particularly children who already, it seems, are less likely to get sick from the coronavirus, are less likely to transmit it to others. Was this really the right policy choice? You know, I think that's a question we can't answer right now, but I think it's worth asking.
So it looks like there's a question from Ellen Nelson Larson. I've unmuted you. So go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. I was just curious, and when in your research, have you drilled down in these categories at all to look at different ways technology is delivering education and evaluating and comparing those, different pedagogical approaches, looking at content acquisition and how well those systems deliver content?
That is definitely in the agenda. It's it requires a lot of information that we don't currently have, including, as you say, you know, what's the learning taking place. So, but definitely is part of the big. You know, there's that famous phrase that what is it? Don't let a crisis go wasted. I hope that at least in this period we learn much more about EdTech than we have been able to do in the past.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
That was my field as a career after I left public education.
Wow.
There was a question from Marimo Burke.
My question was just, I was wondering if your program is studying how students with disabilities, physical or intellectual intellectual are being impacted by school closures and by lack of accessible online learning. Do you know of any programs that are doing a good job of reaching these students?
That's a very good question. At the scale that we've looked at this, we haven't been able to hone in on that question. I do think it's an issue that some organizations specialize on, and I'd be happy to look into that and get back to you on where to go. Don't have it on top, but in the conversations we've had with others from the center, we know that there are some organizations that are particularly focused on children with learning differences, also children on the spectrum and other disabilities, children with other disabilities.
Marima, we spoke a little bit about that last week in a seminar with Judy Human, who's a disability rights activist. And it's really interesting, that I think sort of one of the emerging consensuses is that children with disabilities are at even added more risk because sometimes they benefit from more human interaction and special attention in their learning, but also they tend to have much less access to technology at home. They tend to live in poor homes, homes with more needs, and there's a special stress there. And if they were missing their education already, they're missing it
even more
×2 now.
Yes.
Both in social interaction and education.
It's interesting that in the Nordic countries, I know in Denmark and in Finland and Norway, they, when they closed schools, they had a clause that said that for children with disabilities, for families who are first responders and who are required to send their kids to school, those schools would remain open. So it's interesting how different societies really care for these children and prioritize.
Oh, cool. I was going to go to Kate Hoffman, a current student of ours, and I've unmuted you.
Thanks, Christine. And thank you, Emiliana, for sharing with us the data that you had. I'm just curious about if there's any data on the balance between academic content that's being distributed remotely and social emotional content. This could be considered a very traumatic time for many students. And so I'm just wondering how schools and education systems are thinking about that now, as well as if you think there might be a shift in the social emotional versus academic balance moving forward when schools reopen.
That is such a great question. And I think the answer really varies by school system and part of the world, whether there is data or how they're doing it. Even in the US, if you follow kind of in Education Week, they have reports by state and you can get some of that, but not in other countries. So I think it's, again, something that we hope we can see, but I do think you're right that one of the big challenges when schools reopen will be how to address kind of the socio-emotional needs, not just of students, frankly, but also of teachers and other adults and everybody in the community. I think it will be an important aspect that policymakers will need to think about carefully. As I was mentioning, when you look at what's happening in the countries that have reopened, some teachers really are scared of going back to school for their own health, but also those if they live with others who might be in populations at risk. Some parents are, afraid of sending their kids back to school for the same reasons, and so it's a big challenge.
Deborah Lindo, you have a question and some historical perspective on technology. Go ahead, Deborah.
Okay, yeah. I was just reading this article about past, either pandemics or crises in school systems in California. We've had a gazillion of them just in the last 5 to 10 years with fires and, floods and floods, Katrina. I mean, you think of the United States and Katrina, different places like that. So this probably isn't anything like new, except for the obvious nature of this huge, massive pandemic, that the world is facing right now. But my question had to do with some of the experimentations and strategies that were tried in the past. Chicago Public Schools, for example, they did radio lessons, in the golden age of radio. And kids could get daily lesson plans. Parents could get them out of the newspaper, cut them out, and then they'd send them back to school, that sort of thing. But what they found, when kids went back to school, is that there wasn't a significant difference. And this is with only 60% of the population actually even having radios, at that time, or access to a newspaper. So I think the gentleman earlier, Martin, I believe it was, who mentioned the whole idea of data. This is going to be really, really important looking at this, because technology as we know it, if we see that as the solution, then that's a passive response, and it's not necessarily one that will really perhaps get us the result we want. And I see Jeanette there is mentioning other ways of using time, place, and manner, and thinking about it in that regard as well. So I was just curious if you're learning anything about past technology initiatives, like one of your first slides had radio, TV, radio and TV, and then online. And so I'm just wondering if you're starting to gather any data or see any learnings about the differences in those technologies, but also those various initiatives, and how those past initiatives during crisis might lead to some learning about how we might benefit from this in the future moving forward.
Yeah, it's a great question. There, not just during pandemics, but in rural and kind of low-income areas of some of Latin America, or in particular with respect to indigenous populations. I know when some of my former colleagues from the Inter-American Development Bank did some interventions that were rigorously evaluated through randomized controlled trials to try and bring, let's say, engaging math education in indigenous local languages to young students in Paraguay and in Panama. And in both cases, the method was through radio, through very structured lessons that teachers could use in kind of remote villages with their students. And in both cases, they showed positive impacts in terms of student learning in the intended areas. So there is some evidence that particularly in settings where the teacher might be underqualified, or in very rural areas where there aren't enough trained teachers, that having highly structured lessons, and in that case, similarly now we have underqualified parents serving as teachers, and so the more structured guidance we can give these parents to help their children learn during this period, probably the better the results will be. But I think it's still an empirical question as to how systems can do it at scale, and what are the variations, and what may work better. And I think it all, just going to Martin's earlier point, I think it has to do also with what is the counterfactual, right? If your counterfactual is a school where you had really great teachers, where the in-person contact and discussions were engaging, as opposed to some of the schools that I've been to in Haiti or in Africa, where you have 50 or more students, sometimes 100 students in a classroom with a teacher with just a blackboard. What's going to be better? How's the technology or the alternative going to work vis-a-vis the counterfactual? I think those are all questions that we don't have answers to right now, and I hope we will later on.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a question from Jeanette LaForce, and I've unmuted you.
Great. Emiliana, it's good to see you today as well. Thanks for hosting this interesting seminar. I'm really curious about a couple of things, so many, but how could we take advantage of the transition, right? Where people are not rushing to get back to normal, but they are taking in stride the necessary precautions to distance students from one another and, help support a healthy physical environment. Do you see that as a potential opening for the kinds of things you talked about at the very beginning, which is, allowing new structures and breaking down the industrial model? So I'm curious if you're hearing anything like that out in the world, and then would that subsequently give maybe more rise to opening up to other strategies in terms of, much more authentic, much more relevant, rigorous curriculum than we typically see? So I just want to explore that theme really with you.
Thank you. That's a great question. A number of colleagues at Brookings, not just at our center, but also at the Brown Center for Education and the Economy, which is more US focused. We've been discussing this and trying to look at what other countries are doing, in part as a way of provide guidance to US as they, different states reopen schools. And, one of the questions we've asked, in Denmark, they did first the youngest children. And within the youngest, so preschool and primary goes first, middle school and secondary education will go later, and then they're evaluating the impact on health indicators as to when they might open secondary schools. The underlying, I think, reasoning for that decision was probably that they believe that the younger children are less likely to get severely ill based on the data to date, and also are less likely to transmit the disease to others. There's, something also to be said that it's harder to provide a good remote education to younger children than to older children who might have better, study skills, focusing, are able to focus, are more independent learners. So that's also might be an argument. Some of the conversations we've had among our colleagues also in the US, which is a more kind of well-researched country, is that, there are families where, there is an educated parent who is not out in the labor force and who may be okay or may actually be willing to continue schooling their children from home for a period of time after schools open, if they were given the opportunity. And so that's something maybe to exploit in this context where, I know, for example, in Denmark, parents who have one parent who have a household where not both parents are in the labor force, they are also encouraged to continue educating their students from home, even as schools reopen, because that kind of allows them to have these smaller groups of students in school at one time. How you would go about that in the US, when you reopen, do you prioritize, the students who are children of first responders, maybe to address the inequality issue, students whose parents are delivering food, who are working in grocery stores or working in food production plants? I mean, maybe that would be a way to both address inequality and also give them a first shot at having the smaller classes and the different kind of education and having a better opportunity than they do now when they're probably unsupervised and in kind of crowded homes. So these are all questions we're thinking about, and I don't know how you would feel about it. I mean, there's a lot of advantages to that. There's also kind of like a question about maybe stigmatizing students by saying, oh, you're poor and you have a poor environment at home, so you're going to go back to school first. How would that make them feel? I don't know. So lots of questions to consider.
Sure. Thank you.
We have a number of questions, and I think we're going to go next to Martin Carnoy, then Bob Rosenfeld, and then Ishita Ahmed. We'll start with you, Martin.
Hi, Emiliana. I think your data collection is really important. I would urge you to get into as much detail as you can on these data, even within countries, in terms of what even finding out what the experiences of different, I know you alluded to it, to dig down into who's really getting this kind of stuff and who's not getting it. You know, you did number of countries. It would be better, I mean, it would be great if you could get the percentage of kids within each country, et cetera. So I'm urging you to collect more and more data. And the reason for it is that I see some really great studies down the line from these data, because it's an event interruption. And it would be very interesting, for example, you showed the PISA countries. It would be very interesting to see whether, you know, 3 years, 6 years from now, next PISA is 21, then 24, whether there's been a significant effect on the PISA scores of kids 15 years old who've now missed, you know, a certain amount of school. It would be good to know the variation in what they missed and what were the substitutes. Most of, you say, a high percentage of PISA countries actually have provided some kind of substitute. But it'd be interesting to see who got it in the country. So this could be picked up in an international test. It would be really interesting to know if there was a learning loss. That's one measure. There are other tests. For example, the Latin American test does, you know, 3rd and 6th graders. So that would also be interesting to know. The next one is going to be, I don't know when, 2021. So it would be 2020 or 2021. I don't know what it is.
I think it was scheduled for 22 actually.
Whatever. It's, you know, in the future. So those are 3rd and 6th graders. It would be pretty interesting to know what the effect is on test scores. And down the line, it would be interesting to know if, in fact, there's some productivity loss, you know, some income loss down the line. I seriously doubt, by the way, that this will have, compared to whatever else is happening, that this will have any impact on economic growth compared to what else is happening. So goodbye Hanushek and all that stuff, you know, because this is it really, this is telling you that people during a certain period of time actually got less schooling. Is this going to affect, and certainly lower quality schooling. So is this going to affect incomes down the road or economic growth down the road? Anyway, if you collect good enough data, then people can do really interesting studies down the road. So you have I'm putting a lot of responsibility on you to do it.
Well, I'm going to bring you to speak with our donors, because that's what I'm pitching to them.
Yeah, that's important. Tell them Carnoy says, down the road, there are going to be a lot of research studies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you know, it's interesting. A lot of the responses we've gotten, fortunately not from all our donors, but from some of them, is that they're turning right now to the immediate responses, and particularly with respect to health. And so that's another area, you know, concern.
Yeah.
Like a lot of our regular donors who would be like investing in research and education are now really like, no, we want to, you know, our board has decided we're just going to go to addressing the pandemic, health, and immediate response. Forget about, you know, building the, as you say, the infrastructure so we can learn from this.
Yeah, but I actually think that, well, I actually think the lessons down the road for big stuff are going to be more important than what we learn, you know, because there are too many things to control for. I mean, too much is going on at the same time. I mean, really, you got parents at home, not at home. You got quality of parents. You got different stuff being used. There's infinite number of variables, and you can't really figure out. You know something's bad is happening, but you don't. The lessons to be learned from it are very complicated, I think. And by the way, please stop talking about technology as substitute for good teaching. Please. Well, you know, in 2007, I interviewed lots of people at the main teacher training institution in Panama, in Santiago. Those kids did not know anything, and they were being sent out to those schools. So to say, oh, well, we're going to give radio to the indigenous kids and there's some positive effect. Yeah, there might be some positive effect. But why not worry about the other part of it, which is that you're not training the teachers to go out to those kids. You're not even training them to do anything. Now they're doing a little bit better, but it's just unbelievable, unbelievable. I mean, Panama's not a poor country, and this is what they were doing. So that's unforgivable, unforgivable. And the trouble is that if you talk about technology as substitute, they'll never do it.
No, I completely
That's
agree.
the problem.
I do not think technology can ever substitute for,
Yeah,
for the teacher.
don't even go there.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you. Yeah.
I've unmuted you, Bob Rosenfeld.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much. Yeah, I just wanted to share that my brother-in-law, who grew up and lives in Buenos Aires, Argentina, runs a printing press, and the government has given him a contract to print a national standards, national curriculum-aligned workbooks to distribute to students who do not have internet access or unreliable internet access. So I'm wondering if anybody's heard of any of the other stories of other countries or localities or municipalities carrying out a similar program.
I know that Chile is also, and Chile has in Latin America one of the highest rates of internet connectivity, but still there are significant areas of the country that aren't connected. And I know that the ministry took a very proactive stance in printing materials and using a cadre of volunteers and teachers from communities to bring those materials to students. I also heard in a call we had a couple of weeks ago that Hewlett-Packard, even though it's a tech company, has been printing materials aligned to the Common Core in the US and distributing them. And interestingly, the person who runs kind of their education program was saying that the districts and the school districts that are asked them to do that also ask them not to print a lot at once, but rather to print like the materials that students would need to use in 1 or 2 week periods and then resend them so that like they move at a certain pace. So that's interesting too, how different systems are.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
Great. Ashita Ahmed. I'm trying to unmute you, but it's not working. Maybe you can unmute yourself. There you go. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I appreciate all the efforts to collect data to better understand the implication of the crisis. But as you said, a lot of these results will take time to materialize. So I was wondering if there are efforts to understand the learning impacts in real time so governments can adjust their education delivery responses to kind of mitigate this learning loss.
Hi, Ishita, that is such a good question. And I don't have the perfect answer, but I think it's across the world, one of the consequences also of the school closures and the pandemic is that student learning assessments have been suspended in many education systems. So I think this will be hard in the short term. I think our only hope, and not our only hope, but one possibility is to partner with the providers of, online technology that, like certain software platforms, educational technology that do monitor how students use and how they progress through the content. That would be interesting, I think, as a first stab to see what worked, what didn't, how students were engaging and whether, whether they were taking longer periods of time or shorter periods of time to achieve the learning objectives. I think there's a lot of things we can do, but I don't think we will be able to really know at scale, how to adjust remote learning for all kids.
So I want to call on Abdul Hamid Haidar, who is actually, he's a student here and he's actually working on some educational technologies. They're very interesting. Abdul Hamid.
Hi, thank you, Christopher, and thank you so much, Emiliana. So I wanted to ask about reaching offline students. I know you talked a bit about TV and radio, but I'm very interested in using SMS as an avenue to reach those students. It's something I'm working on, and I wanted to know if you have seen in your research any countries doing that, or if there's a history of efforts like that.
That's a really good question. I was actually giving a similar talk a few weeks ago, right when the report came out, to a group of students and faculty at the University of Los Andes in Colombia. And one of them said that they work in rural areas in Colombia and that the main way in which they're providing educational materials is through WhatsApp, so through text and SMS. So I think that is something that, you know, throughout rural areas in the developing world, there is more cell phone access than internet, obviously, and physical. So I think it is a very promising, I mean, I don't know how effective it is, but again, like, is it better than nothing? Probably. Is it the best? Probably not, you know, so we'll have to see.
Hamid, we spoke about it the other day in the context of children in emergency situations. Do you have any thoughts that you want to share with the group on?
Yeah, so I think a lot of current SMS models are relying on kind of teachers texting material. What I was thinking more of was in terms of like an autonomous kind of system that kind of think like a chatbot of sorts, where material could be kind of interactively shared with students, kind of questions asked and students can answer as a way to reach people who don't have the bandwidth for internet and who can't access TV and radio, because that also has some like infrastructure requirements, as something that could be kind of scaled beyond just, like I said, just sharing material. But if I guess like if no countries are doing that, I would want to kind of ask why, or if there are like major impediments to that.
I'm not sure I have the right answer on an answer. It might be that that other options are more easily implementable than maybe they don't have the capacity right now to develop that kind of chat box that you're referring. But it's a great idea. Maybe you can try it somewhere and see.
Cool.
So this is really the disadvantage of the disadvantage. We have 65 million refugees in the world right now. And when they're getting education services, it's often a temporary tie over from UNICEF or an NGO. And, you know, any ways that you can reinforce the capacity of those teachers or help children access some supplemental exercises or support. Be very interesting, I think.
Yeah.
Great. We were going to go to a question from Marie Kodama.
Hi, I just wanted to echo others and thanking you for your time today and sharing your expertise. I have a question about how you think student learning as measured by educational assessments might change as a result of this crisis. Most places rely on like formal standardized ways of delivering educational assessments, and they're not built to be administered in remote settings. So I'm wondering what you think about how the design as well as the role of educational assessments might change.
Wow, what a great question. You know, this morning there was a meeting that I was invited to between the World Bank and the Unesco Institute for Statistics, and they are partnering along with various institutions across the world to develop what they're calling a learning item bank to basically improve what we know about student learning and to build upon assessments at the country level, but also international assessments, and see if there's like a common item bank that countries could agree to apply regularly at a kind of affordable rate, so that, you know, we could have comparable data on learning across the world. It's a project in a very initial stage, but I was excited to see that kind of like the UNESCO, which is kind of has the main responsibility for collecting education information and for monitoring kind of progress toward achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly the goal number 4 of quality education for all. And then World Bank as a big funder and, you know, international organization, if they could, you know, leverage their comparative advantages, but also partner with others, I think this may be doable. But I think it's a huge challenge. Like, as you said, countries differ in their ability to to assess data. They differ in their capacity. There even countries that assess student learning, let's say periodically, don't always do all grades or all students in a grade. So a big challenge, if you really want to, I always said this when I was advising countries from the IDB, that if you really want to, if you want to assess, to take like the temperature and then, you know, say something broad, like our system is not improving or this, but you don't really care about knowing in detail what you need to do to improve, then having kind of like sample-based periodic assessments are fine. But if you really want to improve, then you really have to measure ideally the learning progress of all students in your system and be able to link that to the types of interventions that they're exposed to so that you can help build capacity to improve learning. And that's so much more costly, and our systems rarely are in a place to do that well. So I think it's a big challenge. Again, it's one where I think if you think about what's the goal of assessing, I think that was my message this morning to the group of Unesco and World Bank, was really, it should be to help countries improve and to help teachers in particular at the individual level figure out what they should do and how, and support them so that students learn. And then you kind of have to think very differently about how to assess and how often and how many kids, you know.
I really love that question, Marie, and I love this discussion because as a mother of a 9th and 10th grader here in some of the most competitive high schools in the United States, we're finding that our 9th grade daughter is actually loving school these days because it's far less competitive. She can get up at her own time, day, work on it whenever she wants, and also the opportunity to FaceTime with her friends and do the work with her friends. It's so much more collaborative. So everything about the way the school is organized that I find to be very patriarchal, with the competition and the drive to achieve the high scores and the top grades, everything's being flipped in this environment. And again, we're talking about a place where everyone has access to lots of technology. And so, you know, it's not possible to really see this scaled up, but I just think, you know, I think it's, yes, we should do these studies and see what students may have lost during this process, but we'll give them a test to evaluate that. But what my daughter is gaining from this experience, I don't think there's a test that will really be able to assess that. It's almost like she's in college now, you know, so I almost wish, you know, high school was more like college and giving students the freedom to learn on their own time. For some students, it just works better. So it's interesting to experience it in your own home.
Emiliana, I wanted to really thank you. I think I'm generally an optimistic person about progress in the world, and we have seen huge increases in enrollment in developing countries in recent years. We look over the span of 10, 15, 20 years. But this crisis has reminded us about how much inequity there still is in the system, and how an event like this or any other disaster can just throw people off balance because of, again, where they live, what their income is, the conditions of their schools, their access to technology, their gender, their citizenship. And there's just so much more work to do. And I think your research and the questions you're raising are really helping us to think more about how we make school systems more resilient. What's the basic infrastructure that needs to be built out? How do we go about, what kind of support do teachers need? And I think, Martin, you reminded us that teachers are, again, the most important input into the education system by far. There's no substitute for them, but they do need extra support in a time of crisis. And that the fact that most, again, I go back to the demographics, most of the young people in the world now are in developing countries. They're in poor countries. And if we don't collectively find a way to support them, to make their school systems more resilient and better quality, we're all going to be in trouble. Because they're the ones who are going to shape the future economy of the world. They're the ones who are going to shape the environment. They're the ones who are going to shape the big questions of peace and stability and security. They're going to shape culture. So it's everyone's duty to make sure that these large number of children are not disadvantaged. And you've given us a really sort of stark picture of what's happening around the world. And I want to thank you for that. And you've also raised a lot of points in this discussion. I think all the people who asked questions and made comments have pointed us to how much we don't know yet and what a rich research agenda there is going forward about the impact of different technologies, the impact of different populations, and so forth. So I want to thank everyone who's participated in this conversation today. It's been really interesting and a really stark reminder of how much work we need to do.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you for all of you for participating, for attending. It was great seeing so many people who I've either learned from in the past or read about through your own work, and then hearing from the students and all the questions and comments. I agree with what Martin said, that the biggest challenge for all of us is to make sure we collect data so that we can learn in the long run from this experience to improve, educational opportunity, particularly for those, as you say, Chris, students in the least, in the poorest countries of the world. And so anything I can do, and I hope you will also be part of that. I look forward to seeing what Stanford does as well.